Mayor, and thank you for the great job that you do. Very much appreciate your being here. And I want to thank Captain Walrath for being here as well, Chief Churches, Chief Sticker, and our members of the City Council, as well as our Deputy Mayor. Whoa, I'm leaving out some people. Our Assistant DA, Jordan York, Joe Cloak from the Chemung County Sheriff's Office, Chief Michalko of the West Elmira Police Department, Lieutenant Thorne, the supervisor of the Drug Enforcement Unit here in Elmira, and Emma Myron, the Director of Community Development. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it very much. And as the mayor mentioned, I am a pro-law enforcement person. I've written lots of laws at the federal level to back up our police and policemen and policewomen. They, every day, they're like our soldiers overseas. They risk their lives for our safety every day. And having lived on the same block, street, in my neighborhood of police officers, and I remember staying at the home of Officer Gemarino's son and Mary Gemarino, when the phone rang, she always worried it was the call she dreaded. That's the life you live when you are defending us. And praise God that never happened to Mr. Joseph Gemarino, Officer Gemarino, but it happens a lot, all too often. And now things have gotten a little worse. Fentanyl is a killer. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times as deadly as regular heroin. It's the Chinese who market it. In fact, I just asked that the Chinese companies, these are major drug companies, and they make these chemicals and send them here. China doesn't treat us fairly. I agree with the president completely on that, and I'm on his side as he pushes China to do better. But these are big drug companies, and they make these chemicals that go into fentanyl and just send them here. Fentanyl is used because they advert the drug pushers and dealers, these horrible people who prey on our people, and particularly our young people. They say, oh, this is super high. But fentanyl is so deadly that one contact with it can kill you. Sometimes if you breathe it in, sometimes even if it gets on your skin. So it is an awful and deadly drug. It doesn't come here. You can't blame any local law enforcement for fentanyl. It's not like crystal meth, which could be made in the rural areas. It comes from overseas. We don't have any of it produced here. Mainly China, sometimes Mexico. Anyway, it's used, they lace it in other drugs, heroin in particular, but other drugs as well. And let me just say, our opioid problem is one of the most serious problems we have here in the Southern Tier. Here are some statistics. In Chemung County alone, there were 62 overdoses, 12 of them fatal in 2017, one a month. 2017, 384 people went into chemical dependency programs. And those are overdoses from heroin or heroin combined with fentanyl. And the combination is called the gray death, which sounds spooky, and it is. Just last week, 2 men who were part of a large opioid manufacturing distribution center were convicted of selling these dangerous fentanyl analogs here in Elmira. I want to salute our police who found them and our DAs who prosecuted them. And I don't know if they've been sentenced yet, but I hope they get a very, very long sentence. These men were charged with conspiracy to possess and distribute 100 grams of fentanyl. And it was reported that the thousands of fentanyl pills that they manufactured led to the death of 2 people and the hospitalization of another. That's how terrible this is. So I've worked very hard. I've worked very hard on drug enforcement, law enforcement for a long time. I wrote the 3 Strikes You're Out law. I wrote the federal death penalty law because I think it is appropriate in certain times. But we've worked very hard to go after fentanyl. And last year, or 2 years ago, we passed a law that helped detect fentanyl at the borders. Fentanyl, they have these machines called mass spectrometers. And mass spectrometers, if there's a little bit of fentanyl in the air, and every substance, even this wood, sends molecules into the air, these machines could detect it. And now there are many more of them at our ports of entry and at our larger post offices, because the Chinese sometimes mail this stuff in the mail. That's how brazen they are. And these machines detect it. And that's a good thing, and that's the law. And in the recent budget that was just passed, there was more money for that. But there's another step we have to take called the Power Act. It's bipartisan, most of these things are. Senators Brown, Portman, Tillis, and Gardner are the sponsors, and I am pushing it hard. It's called the Power Act. The Power Act allows you, I mentioned how these machines detect fentanyl, but the Power Act allows portable devices to detect it. Why is that so important? Because if a police officer comes upon a drug dealer, he should know if that drug dealer has fentanyl. Because again, getting it on the skin, getting and breathing it in can kill you. And certainly create lots of problems. And the Power Act gives these pays for these portable devices to go to our local police departments. Right now, I'm sure, chiefs, there's a protocol of how your men and women who approach a drug bust deal with fentanyl, and they got to be real careful. It slows them down, frankly. But safety has to come first. Well, with these devices, they can tell right away. The problem is they cost about $80,000 a device. You don't need one for each police officer. You can get how big is the Elmira Police Department, Mayor?
71.
Yeah, so, 2 or 3 of these total would be enough, and then they would be given to officers who are in the Drug Enforcement Division, who are out on patrol and, in an area where there's drugs and all that. But $240,000 is a lot of money for a smaller city like Elmira. And so the Power Act provides those dollars, just like we provided dollars at the ports of entry. It's a $20 million grant program, which in federal terms is not that much. But it's aimed at the smaller cities. Rochester or New York City can afford these devices. It's a lot harder for Elmira to do it, or Watkins Glen, or any other smaller city or town. And so this would aim these devices at the smaller police departments. So I am here to tell our men and women from law enforcement that we're for you. The previous bill we had sailed through the Congress. Democrats and Republicans. I was one of the leading pushers of it, bad word, sponsors of it. And President Trump signed it. There was no conflict whatsoever. The same thing will happen if we can get the Power Act done and done quickly. The goal is to get it done in the spring and summer, so that by October 1st, when the next budget passes, this money will be available to our local police departments. Okay? With that, I think there are a couple of people who are going to say a few words other than the mayor. Let's see. Chief Walrath, our police chief here in Elmira, commanding the 71 men and women.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
I will just make one note. I'm Captain Walrath, standing in for Chief Joseph Kane with the Elmira Police Department.
You're not Chief Walrath.
No, that's all right, Senator.
I was wondering, what happened around here? The chief gets a captain's bars? Yeah, I didn't know what's going on. What's your name?
Captain Walrath. Gene.
Oh, Captain Walrath,
Yes.
but not chief. Got it. Okay, I got the right name anyway.
Yes, sir. Promotion.
Yeah. Hey, maybe, I was visiting one of our Catholic parishes, and I mistakenly called the priest Monsignor. And about an hour later, he got a call from the diocese making him a Monsignor. He called me and said, "How'd you know?" I said, "That was just a mistake." So, get promoted, it's not me.
Thank you. As the Senator pointed out, our community has certainly been affected by the drug crisis facing our nation. The recent DEA investigation is a stark reminder of how the criminal element preys on members of the community. The Elmira Police Department assisted in this investigation, which resulted in the arrest of numerous individuals involved in a large-scale opioid manufacturing and trafficking organization that operated in the southern tier of New York between 2015 and May of 2017. The organization imported bulk quantities of fentanyl from China, most likely, through the mail, and ultimately produced pills that were made to look like legitimate 30-milligram Percocet pills. These pills were then distributed throughout the Elmira area. The senator mentioned the 2 deaths and at least 1 overdose that were directly linked to this traffic organization. The Elmira Police Department, like so many law enforcement agencies, is exposed to these illicit drugs on an almost daily basis. The ability to secure these high-tech portable drug screening devices will enable officers to identify controlled substances in suspected narcotics quickly and safely. Our current drug testing kits only test for specific substances, and they require an officer to open the packaging, remove a sample from this drug, and place that into the provided pouch. The ability of these high-tech devices to scan the substances without removing them from the packaging greatly decreases the risk of exposure to the officers handling and testing these narcotics. The testing also simplifies the procedure. An officer can scan for numerous controlled substances in a single definitive test, which does also reduce the time that it's going to take for that. Unfortunately, most local law enforcement agencies lack the funds to purchase this costly equipment, and the POWER Act would enable those agencies to hopefully get that equipment.
Thank you, Chief. I mean, his presentation was so good, Mayor, he should be a chief. Okay. Anyone else want to say a few words? No, but it was a great job. Thank you, Captain. We're ready for, we'll take questions on this subject first. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any police departments in New York that are currently using this device?
A few, I think New York City has a few, but even they don't have enough. But the money here is aimed at the smaller police departments.
And what has their feedback been from these?
Great. It saves lives, and it makes our law enforcement more effective, because if you know someone's dealing in heroin, it might be laced with fentanyl. And as the chief mentioned, as the captain mentioned, it's very hard. You've got to be real careful. It slows everything down. So it helps both with safety, number one reason, but number two, with making law enforcement even more effective. Yes, ma'am.
I know this is targeted at fentanyl, which is linked to the opioid crisis
Right.
and heroin, but you've mentioned other substances, so I'm wondering, is this also effective?
Now,
with
this
that?
machine works for fentanyl because fentanyl, one of the reasons it's so deadly, I forgot the word, the chemists use a word, but even if it's a pill, even if it sends molecules into the air, and that's how they're able to detect it by just a scan. Any other questions on this subject? Okay, well, I want to let you men of law enforcement and the mayor know that the Southern Tier Press Corps has a lot of very curious questions. So you may not want to stand near me when I answer them, because they'll be more political than this stuff. So if you don't want to, that's fine. If you want to stay here, no one will attribute my answers to you, okay? If you disagree with them. Go ahead.
I have questions about national emergency.
Yes.
I guess the most obvious one is the president says he's going to be taking funds from somewhere else.
Yep.
Do you have any concerns about where those funds are?
Well, I wouldn't like to see that, well, number one, on emergency. So there are standards for what makes an emergency. And actually, this has a Southern Tier, or almost a Western New York relevance. So the last major case, Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, tried to take over the steel mills during the Korean War. And there was a famous decision written by Supreme Court Justice Jackson. Guess where he's from? Jamestown. Yeah, he's a very famous Supreme Court justice. And he said when Congress rejects it, it's the least likely to be a emergency. So I have a feeling the courts may well rule that this won't work as an emergency. Don't know, can't predict it, but that's what Jackson said, Justice Jackson.
Can you talk about what you think the president should be doing instead to get his point across?
Well, persuade enough people. I mean, the debate really was whether it should be a big wall or it should be fencing and detection devices, not the fentanyl, but we have drones that can tell the difference between a deer and a person, you know, as they cross the border. We have sound devices that can detect anybody walking like a couple of miles away, and I think those are the things that work best.
And you said most of the fentanyl is actually coming from outside.
Well, the fentanyl comes from China. That doesn't have much. 90% of the drugs that come in don't come across the border, don't come across the unguarded border where we're talking about what to put there, but come through the portals of entry. And they come in cars, usually, and they hide them. There was even just I saw an article where they put bags in the stomachs of puppies. And these drug dealers will stop at nothing. So I think, you know, whatever you think should be on the border, it's the portals that need more help, and that's what we passed in this act that I mentioned that dealt with the mass spectrometers to detect fentanyl coming through the ports of entry. And those are the places where trucks and cars can come through.
A bill that was introduced by Senator Akshar is basically trying to knock off supervised injection sites. I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with that, his bill. It's a state bill, so I wouldn't say much on that.
I have another question.
Okay, if no one else does, we'll let you get your next one.
This is about Congress.
Yes.
And the law that's allowing the president to enact a national emergency, some have in the past, and most recently Jonathan Turley from George Washington said that he thinks Congress should take action and sort of make changes to that so that it brings in presidential power.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
specify-
we've had a whole bunch of emergencies, but they've only been in 2 instances. One, war, like President Bush declared a state of emergency after 9/11, and Other Bush, H.W. Bush, declared one after the Iraq War. Everyone was fine with that. And then with diseases, when there's a disease that might come in, you can't wait for Congress, like when we had that Ebola scare a few years ago. That was an emergency. This one doesn't fit an emergency because it was debated by Congress, and, you know, it's been a problem that's been going on for a long time as opposed to an immediate problem. So I think that's what Turley was talking about, to narrow it to that.
And you think lawsuits are going to be enough to bring this in?
Well,
Which would be
the lawyers say the chances of it succeeding are not that great. I'm not an expert lawyer on this issue. Okay?
Could you speak to this bill being one of the ones that are bipartisan?
Yes. There's a lot we do that's bipartisan. I mean, the press, no offense to all of you, but the national press writes about the fights all the time. But we've passed lots of bills, and praise God, one of the areas where things are very bipartisan is law enforcement, where most people come together because they want to get after the criminals and protect the police officers. So there's a lot of bipartisan stuff that goes on. Okay? Well, great. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for coming, and I want to thank the men and all the men and women they represent for the great work they do to protect us and keep us safe.